Can I eat with you? The question was so small, so quiet. It shouldn't have been able to stop a room full of million-dollar conversations, but it did. The clink of crystal glasses faded. Silverware hovered midair. And for a single suspended second, every eye in the room turned toward the voice that didn't belong. The restaurant was the kind of place where even the air felt expensive, thick with the scent of butter, aged wine, and quiet arrogance. Soft golden light spilled from chandeliers shaped like cascading glass, reflecting off polished marble floors so clean they mirrored the world above them. Men in tailored suits leaned back in velvet chairs, discussing deals worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. Women in silk dresses laughed softly, their voices measured, controlled, like everything else in the room. This was not a place for interruptions, and certainly not for a child. She stood near the edge of a long private table, small enough to be overlooked, yet somehow impossible to ignore. Her name was Lily Carter. Her sneakers were worn at the edges, the white faded into a tired gray. Her oversized sweater hung loosely over her thin frame, sleeves pushed up just enough to reveal small hands clenched together, as if holding on to courage that threatened to slip away. Her hair, a soft shade of brown, was pulled back hastily, strands falling loose around her face. She looked like she had wandered in by mistake, like she had stepped into the wrong world. But her eyes told a different story. They weren't lost. They were steady, fixed on one man sitting at the center of the table. Jonathan Hayes, the kind of name that carried weight even when spoken in a whisper. At 48, he was the architect of a billion-dollar empire, a man whose decisions could shift markets and shape futures. His suit was charcoal, perfectly cut, his watch understated but worth more than most cars parked outside. He sat with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to ask for anything in his life. And now, someone was asking him, "Can I eat with you?" Lily repeated, her voice just a fraction stronger this time, though still soft enough that it felt like it might disappear if no one answered. A ripple moved through the table, subtle but sharp. One man cleared his throat. Another leaned back, eyes narrowing with mild irritation. A woman glanced down at her plate, as if pretending she hadn't heard. It wasn't anger that filled the space. It was discomfort, the kind that comes when something doesn't fit, when reality intrudes where it isn't supposed to. Jonathan didn't respond right away. His gaze rested on the girl, unreadable. Not cold, not warm, just measuring, like he was trying to decide what she was worth in a world that priced everything. To his right, a partner in a navy suit leaned closer, lowering his voice, but not enough. Someone should call security. The word hung there. Security. As if she were a problem to be managed, not a person to be seen. Near the back, a manager had already started moving, his polished shoes silent against the marble as he approached, posture tight, with urgency masked as professionalism. Lily noticed. Of course she did. Her fingers tightened slightly, but she didn't step back. She didn't run. Instead, she took a small breath, the kind people take when they know the next few seconds might change everything, even if they don't know how. "I'm not asking for anything expensive," she added quickly, her voice steady but carrying something deeper now, something that cut through the room more sharply than before. She hesitated, eyes flickering briefly to the empty chair at the edge of the table, then back to Jonathan. "I just wanted to sit." The manager reached her then, hand already half extended, ready to guide her away with practiced politeness that would feel like rejection wrapped in a smile. Around them, conversations tried to restart, but they faltered, like engines that couldn't quite turn over. Because something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that everyone felt it. A single question, asked by someone who wasn't supposed to be there, had cracked the illusion of the room. And now, all that remained was the answer. The manager's hand stopped just inches from her shoulder, as if something invisible had frozen him in place, because Jonathan Hayes had finally moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a quiet shift that carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. His fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as he leaned back in his chair, eyes still fixed on the girl, studying her in a way that made the entire room feel like it had been reduced to just two people, the most powerful man in the room and the smallest, and yet somehow, the balance between them did not feel as certain as it should have been. "This table isn't for you," he said at last, his voice calm, even, almost gentle, but final in a way that left no room for argument. And the words landed not like an attack, but like a door quietly closing, the kind that did not slam, but still left you standing on the wrong side of it. The manager exhaled softly, relieved, straightening slightly as he prepared to carry out the unspoken next step. "Come with me, sweetheart," he said, his tone polished and practiced, the kind reserved for situations that needed to be resolved quickly and discreetly. Lily did not move, not at first, her eyes flickering for the briefest second, not with tears, not with anger, but with something quieter, something that felt heavier than both, as if she had expected the answer and still hoped, just a little, that she might be wrong. Around the table, shoulders relaxed again. Conversations began to restart in cautious fragments. A man chuckled under his breath. Another lifted his glass, the fragile rhythm of wealth, attempting to stitch itself back together. But it was uneven now, slightly off, like a song played just out of tune. Lily glanced at the empty chair one more time, then nodded once, small and controlled, as if accepting a decision that had already been made long before she ever asked the question. She turned slightly toward the manager, ready to follow, when something caught the corner of her eye. A folded napkin resting perfectly beside a place setting, crisp, precise, shaped into a clean, elegant fan. Her gaze lingered on it for a second longer than it should have, and then, almost without thinking, her small hand reached forward, gently adjusting the fold, just a slight shift, a subtle correction, transforming it from ordinary to exact, the kind of detail most people would never notice, but one that, in a room like this, meant everything. The movement was delicate, practiced, instinctive, like muscle memory rather than thought. The manager frowned slightly, confused. "Please do not touch that," he said quickly, but it was too late, because across the table, someone had noticed. An older man seated near the far end, his hair silver, his posture straight despite his years. Paused mid-sip, his eyes narrowing not with annoyance, but with recognition. He set his glass down slowly, leaning forward just enough to get a better look. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the low murmur like a quiet blade, and the room shifted again, attention snapping back. The manager hesitated, unsure. Lily froze where she stood, her hand retreating slightly, unsure if she had done something wrong. The older man gestured toward the napkin. "Who showed you that fold?" he asked, his tone no longer casual, but sharp with curiosity. Lily blinked, caught off guard, her fingers brushing lightly against each other as if grounding herself. "My dad," she answered softly, the words simple, but carrying a weight that lingered in the air longer than expected. The man exchanged a quick glance with another guest, something unspoken passing between them, because that fold was not common, not something taught casually. It belonged to a level of service so precise it bordered on art, the kind found in places where perfection was expected and anything less was unacceptable. Jonathan's gaze shifted, not away from her, but deeper, as if reevaluating something he thought he already understood. His posture changed almost imperceptibly, the slightest tightening of his jaw, the faintest crease forming between his brows. "Your father," he repeated, his voice quieter now, more focused. "What did he do?" Lily hesitated, just for a moment, her eyes dropping briefly to the floor before lifting again, steady despite everything. "He worked in places like this," she said, her voice still soft, but clearer now. "He used to say details matter more than anything, because people notice even when they pretend they do not." The words hung there, simple, honest, and somehow heavier than they should have been, because in a room built on appearances, on perfection, on control, a small girl had just reminded them all of something they had long forgotten, and for the first time since she had spoken, Jonathan Hayes did not look like a man who had all the answers. He looked like a man who had just realized he might have missed something important. The silence that followed her answer did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath, unsure of what came next, because something had shifted again, not in volume, but in weight. Jonathan Hayes leaned forward slightly now, his attention no longer casual, no longer distant, but fixed, deliberate, as if the pieces of a puzzle he did not know he was solving had just begun to fall into place. "What was his name?" he asked, his voice lower, more focused, and for the first time, there was something else beneath it, something that did not belong to a man who controlled everything around him. Lily hesitated, her fingers curling slightly against her sleeve, the fabric soft and worn beneath her touch. She looked at the table, at the gleaming silverware, the untouched plates, the perfect order of a world she had only ever seen from the edges, then back at him, steady again. Daniel Carter, she said. The name's simple, but it landed like a stone dropped into still water. The reaction was not loud. It was not dramatic, but it was there, subtle and unmistakable, a flicker across Jonathan's face, quick enough that most would miss it, but not quick enough to disappear completely, because recognition is not something you can fully hide, especially when it arrives uninvited. His jaw tightened just slightly, his fingers pressing more firmly against the table as if grounding himself. Somewhere in the back of the room, a glass was set down a little too hard, the soft clink echoing longer than it should have. Jonathan leaned back slowly, his gaze no longer just observing, but searching, reaching into a past he had not thought about in years, a past that did not belong in rooms like this, not anymore, but somehow had found its way back. He worked for me, he said quietly, not as a question, but as a realization forming in real time. Lily nodded once, a small movement, but certain. Yes, sir, she replied, and there was no accusation in her voice, no bitterness, just truth, plain and unadorned, which made it heavier than anything else she could have said. Around the table, the atmosphere shifted again. Conversations had stopped completely now, attention no longer pretending to drift away. Because this was no longer a small interruption. This was something else, something personal, something that did not belong to the polished surface of the evening. Jonathan's eyes moved away from her for a brief second, just long enough to break the connection, as if he needed distance to think, to remember, to piece together fragments of a story he had long filed away and forgotten. But memory does not disappear. It waits, quiet and patient, until something calls it back, and now it had been called. He was a server, Jonathan said slowly, more to himself than to anyone else. One of the best. The older man at the far end nodded slightly, confirming it without words, because he remembered too, the precision, the discipline, the quiet pride in every detail, the kind that turns simple service into something more, something almost invisible unless you knew how to see it. Lily's eyes softened just a little, not with relief, not with hope, but with recognition, like hearing a piece of someone you loved spoken out loud in a place they no longer existed. He said the same thing, she added, her voice gentle, that he was proud of his work. Jonathan's expression shifted again, something tightening, something unresolved. He left, he said, the words flat, controlled, but there was a question buried inside them. Unspoken. Lily shook her head slightly, the movement slow, careful. No, sir, she said, and for the first time, there was a faint tremor beneath her calm, not fear, but something closer to truth pressing against the edges. He did not leave. The room seemed to lean in, invisible but undeniable, every person caught between curiosity and discomfort, because they could feel it. Now, whatever this was, it was not simple, it was not clean, and it was not finished. Jonathan's gaze snapped back to her, sharper now, more intense. What do you mean? He asked, and this time, there was no distance in his voice, no barrier, just a direct line between question and answer. Lily held his gaze, steady despite everything, despite the room, the eyes, the weight of where she stood. He was let go, she said quietly, after something went wrong. The words were careful, not accusing, not defensive, just placed gently into the space between them. But they carried enough weight to shift everything again. Jonathan did not respond immediately, his expression unreadable now, but no longer distant, because somewhere beneath the surface, something had begun to crack, not loudly, not visibly, but enough that the man who had dismissed her only moments ago was no longer sitting in the same certainty. And for the first time that night, the power in the room did not feel one-sided anymore, because truth, even when spoken softly, has a way of leveling everything. The words did not echo, but they lingered, settling into the room like dust that no one could quite brush away. Jonathan Hayes remained still, his expression composed on the surface, but something beneath it had shifted in a way that could not be undone. His fingers slowly withdrew from the edge of the table, folding together as if he needed something to hold on to, not physically, but mentally. Because control had always been his foundation, and now, for the first time that evening, control felt uncertain. Something went wrong. He repeated quietly, not as a challenge, but as if testing the shape of the memory against the truth standing in front of him. Lily nodded once, her posture small but steady, her voice calm in a way that did not belong to a child, but to someone who had learned early how to carry things that were too heavy. "Yes, sir," she said, and the simplicity of her tone made the words land harder, because there was no exaggeration, no emotion added to sway the moment, just truth placed gently but firmly where it could not be ignored. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting for a second, not away from her, but inward, searching through years of decisions, meetings, reports, names that once mattered and were then filed away, forgotten in the constant forward motion of a life built on progress. Because in his world, mistakes were numbers, not faces, outcomes, not stories. And yet now, a story stood in front of him, asking to be seen. "There was an incident," he said carefully, his voice measured, each word chosen with precision. "A complaint, something about protocol, a violation of standards." The phrasing was familiar, the kind used in reports and summaries, clean and controlled, designed to explain without exposing. Lily listened, her eyes never leaving his, and when he finished, she shook her head slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet correction. "That is not how he told it," she said softly. And again, there was no accusation, just a difference in truth. The older man at the end of the table leaned forward a little more now, his interest no longer hidden, because he could feel the gap between those two versions, the polished one and the real one. Jonathan's jaw tightened faintly, not out of anger, but out of something closer to discomfort, because he was no longer speaking from certainty. "Then how did he tell it?" he asked, and this time, there was something else in his voice, something closer to willingness. Lily took a small breath, her hands still at her sides, fingers gently curled, as if holding onto the memory itself. "He said he fixed something that was not supposed to be fixed," she began, her words slow, deliberate, as if each one mattered. "A guest's table setting was wrong, something small, but important, and he corrected it before the meal started." A faint ripple passed through the table, subtle but real, because in a place like this, details were not small, they were everything. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly, the pieces beginning to shift again. "That is not a violation," he said, more firmly now, almost reflexively, as if defending a system he had built. Lily nodded again, agreeing. "He said the same thing," she replied, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of emotion in her voice, not anger, not sadness, but something quieter, something that came from remembering someone else's belief. But someone higher up said he overstepped, that it was not his place. The words settled into the space between them, and this time, the silence that followed was different, heavier, because it was no longer just about what happened, but about why. Jonathan's gaze shifted slightly toward the others at the table, not seeking answers, but sensing the presence of something larger than a single decision, a system of authority, of hierarchy, of lines that were not meant to be crossed. Even when crossing them made things better. "He was written up," Jonathan said slowly, the memory sharpening now, edges becoming clearer, and then dismissed. The words felt different now, not just procedural, but personal, because they no longer existed in isolation. They were connected to a face, a name, a child standing in front of him. Lily's eyes softened again, just slightly. "He said he was proud anyway," she added quietly. "He said doing the right thing mattered more than keeping the job." The statement hung in the air, simple, but powerful, because it challenged something fundamental, not loudly, not aggressively, but undeniably. Jonathan did not respond right away, his posture still, his expression controlled, but the certainty that had once defined him was no longer intact. It had been interrupted, questioned, and now it was beginning to shift, not in a way that could be seen immediately, but in a way that would not go back to what it was before. And in that moment, the room that had once felt untouchable, perfect, complete, now felt something else entirely. It felt exposed. Jonathan Hayes lowered his gaze to the table, not in defeat, but in reflection, as if the polished surface in front of him had suddenly become a mirror he could no longer ignore. The soft glow of the chandelier above catching the faint tension in his expression. His world had always been built on decisions that moved forward, fast, efficient, unquestioned. But this moment demanded something slower, something deeper. And for a man like him, that was unfamiliar territory. What happened after that? He asked, quietly, his voice no longer carrying the same authority it had before, but something more human, more searching. Lily shifted her weight slightly, her small frame still standing at the edge of a table where she clearly did not belong, yet somehow now felt like the center of it, her fingers brushing lightly against each other again, grounding herself in the memory she was about to share. He tried to find another job, she said, her tone steady, though softer now, like each word had to travel through something heavy before reaching the surface. But people talk, and once you are labeled as someone who does not follow rules, it becomes harder. A faint murmur moved through the room, not spoken, but felt, because everyone there understood reputation, how quickly it could build and how easily it could break. Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly again, but this time it was not about control, it was about realization. Lily continued, her voice still calm, but carrying something deeper now. He said it was okay, that we would be fine, that doing the right thing meant something, even if no one else saw it. Her eyes flickered for just a moment, not away, but inward, holding on to a memory that clearly mattered more than anything in the room. But things got harder, she added, and this time, there was no need to explain further. The simplicity of the words painted the picture clearly enough. The kind of hardship that did not need details to be understood, the kind that slowly changes everything. Jonathan leaned back slightly, his breath measured, controlled, but no longer untouched, because the story was no longer abstract. It was real, it had weight, and it had consequences. Is he still working? He asked, the pause before the last word barely noticeable, but present. Lily shook her head gently, her gaze lowering just a fraction before lifting again, steady despite the shift. No, sir, she said softly. He got sick a while after that, and he could not work anymore. The words landed quietly, but they carried a gravity that filled the space more completely than anything loud ever could. The room felt smaller now, tighter, as if the walls themselves had drawn in just enough to make everyone feel it. Jonathan did not speak immediately, his eyes resting on her, but no longer analyzing, no longer measuring, just seeing, truly seeing, for the first time that evening, not just a child out of place, but a story he had unknowingly been part of, a consequence he had never followed to its end. The manager who had once been ready to escort her out now stood still, uncertain, his earlier confidence replaced with hesitation, because the situation had moved beyond protocol, beyond rules, into something far more complicated, far more human. Jonathan's fingers slowly unclasped, resting flat against the table now, as if he had made a decision, not spoken yet, but forming, solidifying beneath the surface, the kind of decision that does not come from power, but from understanding. And when he finally looked up again, meeting Lily's eyes directly, there was something different there, something that had not been present before, not authority, not distance, but recognition, quiet and undeniable. Jonathan Hayes slowly pushed his chair back, the faint sound of wood against polished marble cutting through the silence with more weight than it should have. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because they all felt it, that something irreversible was about to happen, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. He stood to his full height, not imposing, not commanding, but present in a way that carried far more meaning than authority ever could, his gaze never leaving Lily, who remained where she was, small against the scale of the room, yet somehow now the most grounded person in it. What is your mother's name? He asked, his voice calm, but no longer distant. Lily blinked once, slightly surprised by the question, but answered without hesitation. Emily Carter, she said softly. Jonathan nodded once, the name settling into his mind as if it belonged there, as if it should have always been known. He turned slightly, his eyes shifting toward the manager who had earlier been ready to remove her, and in that glance alone, something changed. The kind of silent instruction that did not need to be spoken. The manager straightened immediately, his posture stiff, uncertain. Waiting, Jonathan looked back at Lily, and for a brief second, there was something almost unrecognizable in his expression, something that did not belong to boardrooms or billion-dollar negotiations, something closer to humility. "Is she here tonight?" he asked. Lily nodded gently. "Yes, sir. She is working in the kitchen." Her voice carried a quiet pride, not embarrassment, not apology, just truth. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show the weight he was beginning to carry, not as a burden, but as awareness. "Bring her here," he said, turning again toward the manager, his tone still calm, but now unmistakably firm. The kind of firmness that did not come from power alone, but from decision. The manager hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second, caught between protocol and something new, something he did not fully understand yet. But he nodded quickly. "Yes, sir," and moved without another word, disappearing toward the kitchen. The room remained still, the usual rhythm of luxury completely gone now, replaced by something far more real, far more uncertain. Jonathan stepped away from his seat, moving around the table slowly, not in a rush, not with urgency, but with intention, until he stood just a few feet from Lily, the distance between them no longer defined by status, but by something else entirely. He looked down at her, not from above, but directly, meeting her eyes at her level, as if the height difference no longer mattered. "You have not eaten today, have you?" he asked quietly. Lily hesitated for the first time, not because she was unsure of the answer, but because the question itself felt different. It was not judgment, not curiosity. It was care, and that was unfamiliar in a place like this. She shook her head slightly, her voice barely above a whisper now. "No, sir." Jonathan nodded once, as if confirming something he had already suspected, then reached for the chair beside him. The same empty chair she had glanced at before, and without hesitation, he pulled it back, the sound soft but clear, echoing through the stillness of the room. Every eye followed the movement, every breath held again. Waiting, watching, because this was the moment where everything would either return to what it was, or change completely. Jonathan placed his hand lightly on the back of the chair, then looked at her, his voice steady, but carrying something deeper than anything he had said before. "Sit," he said, not as an order, but as an invitation, one that carried respect, one that restored something that had been quietly taken away. The room did not react immediately, because no one was sure how to. The rules they had always followed no longer seemed to apply. And for the first time that evening, the most powerful man in the room was not defining the moment with wealth or status, but with something far more rare, something far more lasting: dignity. For a moment, Lily did not move, not because she did not understand, but because she did, and that made it harder. The invitation was simple, just a chair, just a place at the table, but it carried something she had not expected to receive. Not here, not like this. Her eyes shifted briefly to the faces around the table, the same faces that had moments ago looked through her as if she did not exist, now watching, uncertain, some uncomfortable, some quietly ashamed, and for the first time, the room did not feel like a place she had accidentally entered. It felt like a place waiting for her decision. Jonathan Hayes remained still, his hand resting lightly on the chair, not rushing her, not filling the silence, just allowing the moment to exist as it was, because he understood now that this was not about a meal. It was about something far more fragile, something that could not be forced. Lily took a small step forward, then another, her movements careful but steady, as if each step carried weight beyond distance. When she reached the chair, she paused again, her fingers brushing the edge of the table, feeling the smooth, cold surface beneath her touch. A world so far removed from everything she knew, and yet now within reach. She glanced up at Jonathan one more time, as if making sure this was real, that it would not disappear the moment she accepted it. He met her gaze without hesitation, his expression calm, but different now. Not the distant control of earlier, but something grounded, something honest, and that was enough. Lily nodded slightly and sat down, the chair soft beneath her, the table no longer out of reach, but in front of her, part of her space now. The shift was quiet, almost invisible, but it changed everything, because in that single act, The invisible line that had separated her from the rest of the room was gone, and everyone felt it. The tension that followed was not loud, but it was undeniable. The kind that comes when something challenges the way things have always been. A server hesitated near the edge of the table, unsure of what to do, her training telling her one thing, the moment demanding another. Jonathan noticed, of course he did, and without raising his voice, without breaking the calm he had established, he simply said, "Please bring her a plate," his tone gentle, but absolute. The server nodded quickly, relief and uncertainty mixing as she moved away, eager to follow a direction that finally made sense. Around the table, the guests shifted slightly, some adjusting in their seats, others lowering their eyes, as if avoiding something they could no longer ignore. The older man at the far end gave a small nod, not to Jonathan, but to Lily, a quiet acknowledgement, recognition without words, and in that moment, respect began to replace discomfort, slowly, subtly, but undeniably. Jonathan returned to his seat, but he did not sit immediately. Instead, he reached for the folded napkin Lily had adjusted earlier, studying it for a brief second before placing it carefully in front of her, exactly as it should be, not correcting her, but honoring what she had done. Lily noticed, her eyes softening just slightly, not with surprise, but with understanding, because she knew what that gesture meant. It was not about the napkin, it was about being seen, truly seen. And as the first dish was gently placed in front of her, the aroma rising warm and inviting, the room seemed to exhale, not returning to what it was before, but settling into something new, something quieter, something more real, because dignity had entered the room, not loudly, not forcefully, but in the form of a simple chair, a shared table, and a choice that no one there would forget. The first bite was small, almost hesitant, as if Lily was not entirely sure she was allowed to enjoy it. The warmth of the food rising gently in front of her, carrying a richness that contrasted sharply with the quiet emptiness she had grown used to. She held the fork carefully, not clumsily, but with a precision that did not belong to someone unfamiliar with settings like this. And Jonathan noticed, of course he did, because now he was paying attention to everything, not just the obvious, but the subtle, the details that had once defined a man he had overlooked. Across the table, conversations did not return to what they were before. Instead, they shifted, quieter, more restrained, as if everyone present understood that they were witnessing something they could not easily explain. The manager returned a moment later, but he was not alone. Behind him stood a woman in a simple black uniform, her posture straight despite the fatigue in her shoulders, her hands lightly clasped in front of her as if unsure whether she was supposed to step forward or remain invisible. Her name was Emily Carter, and the moment her eyes found Lily, everything else seemed to fade. Concern flashed first, quick and instinctive, followed by confusion. Then something deeper, something protective. "Lily," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the quiet of the room. Lily turned immediately, her face lighting with a mix of relief and something else, something that looked like reassurance, as if she had been waiting for this moment to prove something without fully knowing how. "It is okay, Mom," she said gently, her voice calm, grounded in a way that made the words feel stronger than they sounded. Emily stepped closer, her gaze moving quickly between her daughter and Jonathan, trying to understand the situation without disrupting it, because this was not a place where she was used to asking questions. Jonathan stood again, not out of formality, but out of respect, the gesture small but unmistakable, and for a brief second, Emily hesitated, caught off guard by something she had likely never experienced in a room like this. "Miss Carter," Jonathan said, his tone steady, but carrying a sincerity that did not need to be emphasized. "Thank you for coming." The words were simple, but they shifted something immediately, because they acknowledged her, not as staff, not as background, but as a person who belonged in the moment. Emily nodded slightly, unsure of what to say, her voice careful when she responded. "Of course, sir," she said, though her eyes remained on Lily, making sure she was safe. Jonathan glanced at Lily for a brief moment before returning his attention to Emily, and there was no hesitation in what came next, because the decision had already been made. It had been forming since the moment he heard her name. "Your husband," he began, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "Daniel Carter." Emily's expression shifted instantly, a mixture of surprise and something deeper, something that had been carried for years without expectation of being spoken aloud in a place like this. Yes, she replied softly. Jonathan nodded once, as if confirming not just the name, but everything that came with it. I remember him, he said, and this time, there was no distance, no abstraction, just truth, and that truth carried weight, because it was no longer about a past decision, it was about acknowledging the impact of it. The room remained silent, not out of discomfort, but out of attention, because everyone could feel it now. This was no longer just a story unfolding, it was something being corrected, something being brought back into balance, not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. And in that moment, as Lily sat at the table, no longer invisible, no longer out of place, the world that had once excluded her was beginning, quietly and undeniably, to make room. Jonathan Hayes did not look away as he spoke, because some truths lose their meaning when they are delivered without presence, and this was not a moment for distance. I made a decision years ago, he said slowly, his voice steady but no longer untouched by what it carried. And I trusted a report instead of understanding the person behind it. The words settled into the room with a quiet gravity, not dramatic, not forced, but undeniable. Emily Carter stood still, her hands gently clasped, her posture respectful, but her eyes no longer lowered, because something had changed, not just in the man speaking, but in the space itself. Jonathan continued, each word measured, but honest in a way that could not be mistaken. Your husband did not fail the standard, he said. The standard failed him. A subtle shift moved through the room, the kind that does not announce itself, but leaves nothing the same afterward. Lily looked up from the table, her eyes steady, absorbing every word, not with excitement, not with relief, but with something deeper, something closer to recognition. Because this was not about surprise, it was about something being made right. Jonathan stepped closer, not into their space, but into the truth he was now choosing to stand in. I cannot change what happened, he added, his voice quieter now. But I can take responsibility for what came from it. He paused briefly, not searching for words, but allowing them to carry the weight they deserved. Effective immediately. Your position here is secured, not just as staff, but as part of a leadership team that trains others, because people who understand dignity should be the ones who teach it. Emily's breath caught slightly, not loudly, not visibly, but enough to show that the words had reached somewhere real, somewhere long untouched. She did not respond immediately, because some moments do not require words. They require time to be felt. Jonathan's gaze shifted to Lily, softening in a way that no one at the table had seen before. And for you, he said gently, your education, your future, will be fully supported, not as charity, but as recognition. Lily blinked once, her small hand resting lightly on the table, grounding herself in the moment, because this was not something she had come to ask for. This was something that had come from being seen, truly seen. The older man at the far end gave another quiet nod, not surprised, but satisfied, because this was how things should have always worked. The room, once defined by status and distance, now felt different, not less elegant, not less refined, but more human, more aware. Jonathan returned to his seat slowly, not as the center of attention, but as part of a moment that belonged to more than just him. The meal did not resume as it had before. It changed, softened, conversations quieter, more thoughtful, as if everyone present had been reminded of something they had long forgotten. Lily took another small bite, more certain this time, not because of the food, but because of where she sat, not at the edge, not hidden, but present. And in that quiet, powerful shift, something lasting had been created, not wealth, not influence, but something far more rare, the understanding that dignity is not given by status, but by the courage to recognize it in others, even when it arrives in the smallest voice asking the simplest question.